In the heart of Thornfield Manor, a rare orchid hides a deadly secret. Dr. Cedric Hawthorne, a brilliant botanist, is found murdered, pruning shears in his chest. Was it greed, envy, or betrayal that drove the killer? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of ambition. Arthur, the devoted assistant, Sir Reginald, the impatient funder, Dr. Carver, the bitter rival, or Molly, the secretive gardener. In a greenhouse of beauty and danger, one truth blooms, murder leaves clues, and Miss Marple will unearth them all. Chapter 1. The Greenhouse Enigma. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the village of St. Mary Mead, where the air carried the faint scent of roses and freshly turned earth. In the modest village hall, the St. Mary Mead Gardening Society convened its monthly meeting, a gathering of enthusiasts whose passion for flora was matched only by their appetite for local gossip. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her frail figure almost lost in the high-backed chair, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic precision that belied her keen attention to the room's chatter. Her blue eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, missed nothing. Not the flutter of Mrs. Bantry's hands as she boasted of her prized dahlias, nor the sly glance Mr. Pennington cast at the vicar's wife over a disputed seed catalogue. The conversation took a sudden turn when young Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, burst through the door, his face flushed with the urgency of news. "It's Dr. Hawthorne!" he gasped, drawing all eyes. "Found dead in the greenhouse at Thornfield Manor, stabbed with pruning shears." A collective gasp rose, followed by a clamour of questions. Miss Marple's needles paused, her lips pursing slightly. Murder, she thought, was a weed that sprouted in the most unexpected gardens, and Thornfield Manor's greenhouse, with its exotic blooms and whispered secrets, seemed a fertile ground indeed. By evening, Miss Marple found herself in the drawing-room of her old friend, Lady Beatrice Langley, who owned Thornfield Manor. Lady Beatrice, a tall woman with silver hair and a penchant for dramatic gestures, had sent a car to fetch her, insisting that Miss Marple's peculiar gift for seeing through people was needed. Over tea served in delicate porcelain cups, Lady Beatrice recounted the grim details. Dr. Cedric Hawthorne, a botanist of international repute, had been discovered that morning by his assistant, sprawled among his orchids with shears buried in his chest. The police, led by the competent but overworked Inspector Crane, were baffled, and the manor's guests were restless. "It's dreadful, Jane," Lady Beatrice said, her voice trembling. "Cedric was a genius, but such a solitary man. Who could have done this?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already pruning away irrelevancies. "A greenhouse," she mused aloud, "is a place of creation, yet also of control. One wonders what Dr. Hawthorne sought to control, or who sought to control him." Lady Beatrice, accustomed to her friend's cryptic remarks, pressed for her help. With a gentle smile, Miss Marple agreed to visit the manor, packing her small suitcase with a few essentials and her ever-present knitting bag. The journey to Thornfield Manor was short, the car winding through lanes hedged with hawthorn and blackberry brambles. As they approached, the manor rose into view, its stone facade softened by climbing ivy. Beyond it stood the greenhouse, a glittering structure of glass and iron that seemed to pulse with life in the fading light. Miss Marple stepped out, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel, and felt a prickle of anticipation. Murder, she knew, was never merely an act of violence. It was a story, and she intended to read it. Inspector Crane met her at the manor's entrance, his face lined with the strain of a case already slipping beyond his grasp. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with a mix of respect and scepticism. "Lady Beatrice speaks highly of you." She inclined her head, her expression serene. "I merely observe, Inspector. People are not so different from plants. Each has its habits, its needs, its weaknesses." He led her to the greenhouse, where the air was thick with humidity and the heavy perfume of tropical blooms. The scene of the crime was marked by a patch of disturbed soil near a cluttered workbench. The blood now dried into the earth like a grim fertilizer. Dr. Hawthorne's body had been removed, but the pruning shears, their blades still stained, lay sealed in a police bag. Miss Marple's gaze swept the space, noting the rows of exotic plants, their leaves glistening under the glass roof. On the workbench stood a single potted orchid, its petals an unearthly shade of violet, labelled Orchidaceae ignota in precise script. "A rare specimen?" she asked, her voice mild. Inspector Crane nodded. "Worth a fortune, they say. Dr. Hawthorne was secretive about it." She bent closer, her fingers hovering over the pot, and noted a faint smudge of green ink on the label. The greenhouse had 4 entrances, each unguarded, offering easy access to the assistant, the funder, the rival, or the gardener, all present at the manor that fateful night. As she straightened, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with that quiet intensity her village neighbours knew well. "A greenhouse," she said softly, "is a place of secrets, Inspector. And secrets, like seeds, have a way of breaking through the surface." She turned to him, her smile disarming. "Shall we meet these suspects? People, I find, are most revealing when they think they're not being watched." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The morning mist still clung to the grounds of Thornfield Manor as Miss Jane Marple stepped from Lady Beatrice Langley's chauffeured car. Her small, neat figure wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill. The manor loomed before her, its stone walls softened by centuries of ivy, but it was the greenhouse that drew her eye, a crystalline structure glinting in the pale sunlight, like a jewel set against the rolling lawns. Its glass panels, framed in wrought iron, promised a world of secrets within, and Miss Marple, with her knitting bag tucked under her arm, felt a familiar stirring of curiosity. Murder, she reflected, was a disruption of nature's order, and a greenhouse, where life was so carefully cultivated, seemed an almost poetic stage for such a violation. Inspector Crane awaited her at the greenhouse door, his broad shoulders hunched slightly under the weight of a case that had already drawn the attention of the county's newspapers. He was a man of middle years, with a square jaw and a manner that suggested efficiency rather than imagination. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone polite but tinged with the wariness of one unaccustomed to civilian interference. "Lady Beatrice insists you'll see something we've missed. I hope she's right." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "I shall do my best, Inspector," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "A crime scene, like a garden, often reveals its truths to those who look closely." He led her inside, and the air shifted abruptly, enveloping her in a warm, humid embrace laden with the scent of damp earth, crushed leaves, and something sweeter, perhaps jasmine, or the elusive fragrance of orchids. The greenhouse was a marvel, its interior a labyrinth of greenery, where ferns arched gracefully over narrow paths, and exotic blooms in vibrant hues clung to trellises or spilled from clay pots. glass walls soared to a vaulted ceiling, admitting a diffused light that bathed the space in a dreamlike glow. Miss Marple paused, her sensible shoes silent on the flagstone path, and took in the scene with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. Inspector Crane gestured toward a workbench near the centre of the greenhouse, its surface cluttered with tools, glass vials, and stacks of notebooks bound in leather. A patch of soil beneath it was darker, stained with what Miss Marple knew must be blood, though the body of Dr. Cedric Hawthorne had been removed to the coroner's care. "Found him here at 6 this morning," the inspector said, his voice clipped. "Pruning shears in his chest, clean through." The blade was sharp, but the handle was wiped, no fingerprints. He held up a sealed evidence bag containing the shears, their steel glinting dully. Time of death, the coroner reckons, was around 1 in the morning. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the workbench. Amid the clutter stood a single potted plant, its vibrant violet petals catching the light in a way that seemed almost defiant. A label, written in precise black ink, read Orchidaceae ignota. She leaned closer, careful not to touch, and noted a faint smudge of green ink near the pot's rim, as if someone had brushed against it in haste. "This orchid," she said, her tone deceptively mild. "It's quite extraordinary, isn't it?" Inspector Crane shifted uncomfortably. "So they say. Dr. Hawthorne was obsessed with it. Word is, it's worth a fortune. Some new species he was set to announce. Could be motive, I suppose." She straightened, her eyes sweeping the greenhouse's layout. 4 entrances led into the space, one from the manor itself, another from the garden path, a third near the potting shed, and a 4th, smaller door, half hidden by a curtain of climbing vines. Each was unlocked, the inspector confirmed, and each offered easy access to the 4 individuals known to have been at the manor the previous night. Arthur Finch, Dr. Hawthorne's devoted assistant; Sir Reginald Voss, the wealthy funder of the botanist's research; Dr. Evelyn Carver, a rival botanist with a history of professional disputes; and Molly Green, the young gardener who tended the greenhouse's daily needs. All 4 were here, Inspector Crane said, and all claimed to have been elsewhere when the murder occurred. No witnesses, no clear alibis. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture that might have been mistaken for disapproval, but was, in truth, the beginning of a thought taking root. She moved closer to the workbench, her fingers hovering over a pair of gardening gloves, their cuffs crusted with dried soil. Nearby lay a small trowel, its blade clean but slightly bent, as if it had been used with force. A notebook, its pages splayed open, bore meticulous sketches of plants, their Latin names inscribed in Doctor. Hawthorne's angular hand. One page, however, was torn, its jagged edge suggesting it had been ripped out in haste. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the tear, her mind conjuring an image of a hurried hand, perhaps one trembling with guilt or fear. "Do you have the missing page?" she asked, her voice gentle but pointed. Inspector Crane shook his head. "Not yet. We're searching the manor, but it could be anywhere or destroyed." She nodded, her gaze drifting to a small glass vial, half hidden beneath a tray of seed packets. It was stoppered with a cork, its contents a faint amber liquid that shimmered faintly in the light. "And this?" she inquired, pointing without touching. The inspector frowned. "Didn't notice that. Could be one of Hawthorne's experiments. Some plant extract, maybe." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but she slipped the vial into her handbag with a murmured "For safekeeping, Inspector." "I'll have it returned after analysis." She turned her attention to the soil beneath the workbench, noting a faint indentation, a footprint smaller than a man's, pressed into the soft earth. It was not deep, but its edges were sharp, suggesting a recent tread. "A woman's shoe, perhaps?" she mused aloud, glancing at the inspector. He crouched, peering at the mark. "Could be. Molly Green's been in and out, and Dr. Carver was here often by all accounts, but it's hardly conclusive." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Nothing is conclusive, Inspector, until it is. A footprint like a word can tell a story if one listens." She walked slowly along the greenhouse paths, her eyes tracing the orderly rows of plants. A cluster of ferns near the garden entrance bore signs of disturbance, their fronds bent as if someone had brushed past in a hurry. She noted a single leaf, torn and caught on a trellis, its edge smeared with a trace of what might have been mud, or something darker. At the potting shed entrance, a rake leaned against the wall, its tines slightly bent, and a coil of twine lay discarded on the floor, its end frayed as if cut with a blade. Miss Marple's mind catalogued these details, each a thread in the tapestry of the crime. Inspector Crane, growing impatient, cleared his throat. "We've interviewed the suspects briefly," he said. "Finch, the assistant, was in the greenhouse until midnight, sorting notes. Sir Reginald was in the library, arguing with Hawthorne about funding, or so the butler says. Dr. Carver claims she was in her guest room, reading, and Molly Green says she was fetching tools for Hawthorne around 10. None saw anything, or so they claim." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting, a habit that seemed to steady her thoughts. "And yet," she said, "someone was here at 1 o'clock, with pruning shears and a purpose. We must learn what that purpose was." She paused by a row of orchids, their delicate petals trembling slightly in the humid air. One, less vibrant than the Orchidaceae ignota, bore a tiny label in a different hand. Perhaps Arthur Finch's, she thought, recalling his role as the botanist's scribe. "Dr. Hawthorne's work," she said. "Was it purely scientific, or did it promise wealth?" The inspector shrugged. "Both, I'd wager. That orchid was his obsession, but Sir Reginald was pushing to sell it. Dr. Carver, too, had her eye on it, claimed it was her discovery, not his." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A plant," she murmured, "can inspire greed as surely as gold." She turned back to the workbench, her gaze settling on a small brass key half buried under a pile of seed catalogues. It was unremarkable, save for a faint scratch on its surface, as if it had been dropped or mishandled. "This key," she said, pointing. "Does it belong to the greenhouse?" Inspector Crane examined it, his brow furrowing. "Could be. There's a locked cabinet in the potting shed. Hawthorne kept his private notes there. We'll check." Miss Marple's smile was almost imperceptible. A locked cabinet, she thought, might hold more than notes. As they left the greenhouse, the sun broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the lawn. Miss Marple glanced back at the glass structure, its panes reflecting, the sky like a mirror. "A greenhouse," she said softly, "is a place of control, where one bends nature to one's will. But nature, Inspector, has a way of resisting." She thought of her own garden in St. Mary Mead, where roses bloomed despite neglect, and of the people she had known, each with their own desires, their own resistances. "We shall meet these suspects," she continued, her voice calm but resolute, "for it is in their words and in their silences that we will find the truth." Inspector Crane, sensing the weight of her words, nodded curtly. "I'll arrange it, Miss Marple, but I warn you, they're a prickly lot." She smiled, her needles clicking once more. "Prickly," she said, "is often a sign of something tender beneath. Like a cactus, Inspector, they guard their secrets fiercely." As they walked toward the manor, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sorting through the fragments of the scene, the footprint, the vial, the torn page, the key. Each was a clue, but more than that, each was a glimpse into a human heart. And it was there, she knew, that the murderer would be found. Chapter 3. The Assistant's Devotion. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Thornfield Manor's drawing room, casting dappled patterns on the polished oak floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, a soft counterpoint to the tension that hung in the air. The room, with its heavy velvet curtains and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to hold its breath. As Arthur Finch, Doctor, Hawthorne's assistant, entered. He was a slight man in his early 30s, with a scholar's stoop and dark hair that fell untidily over his forehead. His hands, stained faintly with ink and soil, fidgeted at his sides, and his eyes, behind wire-rimmed spectacles, darted nervously toward Miss Marple and Inspector Crane, who stood by the mantel. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, though her blue eyes were sharp and unyielding. "It must be a great shock, losing Dr. Hawthorne so suddenly." Arthur nodded, swallowing hard, and took the seat she indicated. "It's unthinkable," he said, his voice low and strained. "He was more than my employer. He was a mentor, a genius. His work on Orchidaceae ignota, it was going to change everything." His fingers twisted together, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor, as if the weight of his words pressed too heavily upon him. Inspector Crane, less inclined to subtlety, leaned forward. "You were in the greenhouse until midnight, you said, sorting notes. Can anyone confirm that?" Arthur's gaze flickered to the floor, then back to the inspector. "No, sir. I was alone after Doctor. Hawthorne left for the house around 10. He often worked late, but he wanted me to finish cataloguing his latest observations." His voice faltered, and he adjusted his spectacles, a gesture that seemed more habit than necessity. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "You must have been very dedicated, Mr. Finch, to work so late," she said, her tone warm but probing. "Dr. Hawthorne relied on you greatly, I imagine?" Arthur's face softened, a flicker of pride breaking through his unease. "He did. I handled his correspondence, his records, even some of his experiments. He trusted me with, well, nearly everything." His eyes drifted to the window, where the greenhouse was just visible, its glass panes glinting in the morning light. "Nearly everything," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if musing to herself. "And this orchid, this Orchidaceae ignota, you helped with its study?" Arthur nodded, his enthusiasm returning. It was extraordinary. Dr. Hawthorne believed it had properties no other plant possessed. He was close to proving it too." He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself, and his hands stilled in his lap. Inspector Crane seized the moment. "Properties worth killing for, perhaps?" he asked bluntly. Arthur's face paled, and he shook his head vehemently. "No, I'd never. Dr. Hawthorne was like a father to me. I'd have done anything to protect him." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the sheen of tears in his eyes. genuine grief, she thought, or a performance honed by practice. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, a clerk who had wept for his employer's death, only to be found later with stolen ledgers hidden in his attic. Devotion, she knew, could be a mask for darker desires. "Tell me, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Did you notice anything unusual that night? A sound, perhaps, or someone near the greenhouse?" Arthur hesitated, his fingers brushing the cuff of his sleeve, where Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint smudge of soil, not unlike that found near the workbench. "No," he said at last. "It was quiet. I was focused on the notes. Dr. Hawthorne had been agitated earlier, but he didn't say why." "Agitated?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly curiosity. Was that unusual for him? Arthur shifted in his seat. Not exactly. He was under pressure. Sir Reginald kept pushing to sell the orchid, and Dr. Carver was always arguing about credit for the discovery. But that night he seemed distracted. He kept checking the locked cabinet in the potting shed, as if he was worried about something. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a soft click-click that seemed to steady the room. "The locked cabinet," she said, almost to herself. "The one with his private notes?" Arthur nodded, then caught himself, as if realizing he'd said more than intended. "Yes, but I don't know what was in it. He never let anyone see those papers." His voice was firm, but his eyes flicked to the side, avoiding her gaze. Inspector Crane made a note in his pocketbook. "And after midnight, you went to your room?" he asked. Arthur confirmed it, claiming he'd retired to the servants' quarters and heard nothing until the morning's commotion. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his hands clenched when the orchid was mentioned, and the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the coolness of the room. She thought of her nephew's friend, a young man whose loyalty to a mentor had hidden a quiet ambition, revealed only when a missing letter surfaced in his possession. People, she reflected, were like plants in a greenhouse, carefully tended, but capable of unexpected growth. "Mr. Finch," she said, her tone as gentle as ever, "you must have known the orchid's value, working so closely with Dr. Hawthorne. Did anyone else show particular interest in it?" Arthur hesitated, his fingers brushing his cuff again. "Dr. Carver was obsessed with it," he said finally. "She'd come to the greenhouse uninvited, always asking questions. And Sir Reginald, he saw it as a gold mine. Even Molly, the gardener, seemed curious, though she never said much." His voice was steady now, but Miss Marple sensed a careful selection in his words, as if he were pruning away certain truths. Inspector Crane stood, signalling the interview's end. "We'll need to speak with you again, Mr. Finch. Don't leave the manor." Arthur nodded, rising stiffly, and left the room with a glance back at Miss Marple, as if trying to gauge her thoughts. She smiled serenely, her needles never faltering. As the door closed, she turned to the inspector. "A devoted assistant," she said, "is a rare thing, but devotion, Inspector, can be as much a burden as a virtue." Crane raised an eyebrow. "You think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple's smile widened slightly. "I think, Inspector, that Mr. Finch knows more than he says. His hands, you see, they tell a story. Soil on his cuffs, ink on his fingers, and that tremor when he spoke of the orchid. He is loyal, yes, but to whom? To Dr. Hawthorne, or to something else entirely?" She paused, her eyes drifting to the window, where the greenhouse stood like a silent witness. "We must look closer, Inspector. The truth, like a seedling, is often buried just beneath the surface." As they prepared to meet the next suspect, Miss Marple's mind turned over Arthur's words, his hesitations, his guarded glances. She thought of the torn notebook page in the greenhouse, the smudged green ink, and the locked cabinet he'd mentioned so casually. Devotion, she knew, could inspire great sacrifice or great betrayal. And in the quiet of her thoughts, she began to weave a pattern, one that would soon reveal the shape of a murderer. Chapter 4. The Funder's Ambition. The library at Thornfield Manor was a grand affair. Its walls lined with leather-bound volumes, and its air heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned armchair near a bay window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the room's latest occupant, Sir Reginald Voss. He was a man of considerable presence, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with a florid complexion that spoke of rich dinners and richer cigars. His tailored suit, adorned with a gold watch chain that gleamed in the morning light, proclaimed his wealth, but his restless pacing betrayed a mind ill at ease. Inspector Crane stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his expression one of barely concealed impatience as he waited for Sir Reginald to settle. "Thank you for joining us, Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a spring breeze, though her eyes were sharp, noting the way his fingers tugged at his watch chain. "It must be a great loss, Doctor. Hawthorne's passing, especially given your support for his work." Sir Reginald snorted, dropping heavily into a chair opposite her, his bulk causing the wood to creak. "Loss? It's a damned catastrophe," he said, his voice booming. "Cedric was a genius, no question, but stubborn as a mule. That orchid of his, Orchidaceae ignota, could have made us millions, but he kept stalling, fussing over his precious experiments." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment, as she tilted her head. "You speak of the orchid's value," she said mildly. "Was it truly so remarkable?" Sir Reginald's eyes gleamed, a spark of avarice flickering within them. "Remarkable? It's a bloody miracle. Cedric claimed it had medicinal properties, something about curing ailments no drug could touch. I poured a fortune into his research, expecting a return, but he wouldn't hear of selling it, not yet." His voice rose, and he leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Said it needed more study, as if my patience was infinite." Inspector Crane, sensing an opening, stepped forward. "And where were you, Sir Reginald, when Dr. Hawthorne was killed?" "Around 1 in the morning, the coroner says." Sir Reginald's face reddened further, and he waved a dismissive hand. "In my study, going over accounts. The butler can vouch for me. I called for brandy around 11. After that, I stayed put until I retired to bed." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight twitch of his mouth, as if the words were rehearsed. She thought of Mr. Hargreaves, a saint, Mary Mead merchant who had once claimed an alibi, while secretly slipping out to meet a creditor. Men of wealth, she knew, often guarded their time as fiercely as their gold. "You must have been frustrated," she said, her voice soft but probing, "investing so much with no reward." Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed, and he tugged at his watch chain again, the gold links clinking softly. "Frustrated? Of course I was. Cedric treated my money like it grew on trees, not in my bank. But murder? That's nonsense. I needed him alive to finish his work." His hard words were emphatic. but Miss Marple's keen gaze caught a flicker of unease, a shadow that passed across his face like a cloud over the sun. She leaned forward slightly, her knitting resting in her lap. "Did you see Dr. Hawthorne that evening, Sir Reginald? Perhaps to discuss the orchid's future?" He hesitated, his fingers stilling on the watch chain. "We spoke, yes, in the library around 9. He was obstinate, as usual. Said the orchid wasn't ready for market, that it needed more tests. I told him time was money, but he wouldn't budge." His voice carried a note of exasperation, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands clenched, as if reliving the argument. Inspector Crane made a note, his pencil scratching loudly in the quiet room. "And after that argument, you didn't go to the greenhouse?" he asked, his tone sharp. Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. "Number, I told you. I was in my study. Ask the butler." Miss Marple's eyes followed the line of his gaze, which drifted toward the window, where the greenhouse's glass roof was just visible above the garden hedge. She recalled a St. Mary Mead squire, whose bluster had hidden a secret visit to a poacher's den. Men like Sir Reginald, she thought, often believed their wealth shielded them from scrutiny. "Tell me," she said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, "did anyone else share your interest in the orchid's potential? Dr. Carver, perhaps? Or young Mr. Finch?" Sir Reginald snorted again, a sound that seemed to rumble from deep within his chest. "Carver? She's a vulture, circling Cedric's work, claiming it as her own. Always snooping around the greenhouse, asking questions. And Finch, loyal as a dog, but I wouldn't trust him with a shilling. Too devoted to Cedric, if you ask me. As for Molly, the gardener girl, she's harmless, but she's got eyes everywhere. Knows more than she lets on, I'd wager." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click-click, a counterpoint to the tension in the room. She noted the way Sir Reginald's words carried a hint of disdain for the others, as if he alone stood above suspicion. "You sound as though you trusted Dr. Hawthorne's judgment," she said, her tone deceptively mild. "Yet you argued with him. Was there ever a question of his honesty?" Sir Reginald's face darkened, and he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Honesty? Cedric was a scientist, not a saint. He kept secrets, even from me. That locked cabinet in the potting shed, he guarded it like a dragon with its hoard. Said it was his private research, but I paid for every scrap of it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained serene. A locked cabinet, she thought, mentioned again, first by Arthur Finch, now by Sir Reginald. She recalled a village doctor who had kept a locked drawer, only to have it pried open by a curious nurse, revealing debts he'd hidden from his wife. Secrets, she knew, were the currency of motive. "And you never saw what was in that cabinet?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Sir Reginald shook his head, his watch chain glinting as he moved. "Never. But I'd bet my last pound it held the key to that orchid's value." Inspector Crane closed his notebook with a snap. "We'll need to verify your movements, Sir Reginald," he said. "Don't leave the manor without informing us." Sir Reginald stood, his bulk casting a shadow across the room. "I'm not going anywhere," he said gruffly, "but you're wasting time on me. Find the real killer, someone who'd profit from Cedric's death." He strode out, his footsteps heavy on the oak floor, leaving a faint scent of cigar smoke in his wake. Miss Marple turned to the inspector, her knitting needles still moving steadily. "A man of ambition," she said softly, "and one accustomed to getting his way. But ambition, Inspector, can blind one to the cost of one's desires." Crane frowned, his brow furrowing. "You think he's lying about his alibi?" She smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that held a world of knowing. "I think, Inspector, that Sir Reginald sees the world through the lens of profit. His argument with Dr. Hawthorne was no small thing. Money, you see, is a motive that grows like a weed. But we must also consider what he said about the others. Dr. Carver's obsession, Mr. Finch's loyalty, Molly's quiet watchfulness. Each is a thread, and we must follow them all." She rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she gathered her knitting. "Shall we speak to Dr. Carver next?" she asked, her tone as light as if she were proposing a stroll in the garden. But her mind was already at work. Weaving together the clues, Sir Reginald's bluster, the locked cabinet, the orchid's promise of wealth. She thought of the greenhouse, its glass walls hiding secrets as surely as the manor's stone ones. Ambition, she reflected, was a dangerous bloom, and Sir Reginald's was in full flower. Whether it had led to murder, however, remained to be seen. Chapter 5. The Rival's Envy. The conservatory at Thornfield Manor was a smaller, less imposing cousin to the greenhouse, its walls lined with potted ferns and climbing roses that lent the air a delicate sweetness. Miss Jane Marple sat on a wicker chair near a glass-topped table, her knitting needles moving with their customary precision, the soft click-click blending with the distant chirp of a caged canary. The morning light streamed through the conservatory's windows, casting a lattice of shadows across the tiled floor, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing, not the faint scuff on the threshold where someone had recently passed, nor the tension in the posture of Dr. Evelyn Carver, who stood before her, summoned for questioning. Dr. Carver was a woman of angular elegance, her dark hair pulled tightly into a bun, her features sharp and unyielding, like a blade honed by years of academic rivalry. Her grey eyes, cold as winter slate, met Miss Marple's with a mixture of defiance and disdain. She wore a tailored jacket and skirt, the fabric pristine but for a single, barely noticeable smudge of green on the cuff, which Miss Marple's gaze lingered upon for a fraction of a second. Inspector Crane stood by the conservatory door, his arms crossed, his expression one of barely concealed skepticism as he watched the exchange. "Thank you for joining us, Doctor Carver," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a village vicar's, though her eyes held a quiet intensity. "Dr. Hawthorne's death must be a great shock, especially given your shared field of study." Dr. Carver's lips tightened into a thin line, and she folded her arms, her posture rigid. "Shock? Hardly," she said, her voice clipped and precise, like a scalpel cutting through sentiment. "Cedric Hawthorne was a thief, not a colleague. He stole my research, my ideas, and passed them off as his own. That orchid, Orchidaceae ignota, was my discovery, and he knew it." Her words carried a venom that seemed to coil in the air, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers clenched, crumpling the edge of her handkerchief. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his notebook already open. "Strong words, Dr. Carver," he said, his tone sharp. "Where were you at 1 a.m, when Dr. Hawthorne was killed?" Dr. Carver's gaze flicked to him, her eyes narrowing. "In my guest room, reading," she replied, her voice steady but with a faint edge, as if she resented the question itself. "I had no reason to be in the greenhouse at that hour. I'd already seen enough of Cedric's gloating over my work." Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting needles pausing briefly. "Your work," she said softly, as if merely echoing the words. "You must have been deeply hurt, Dr. Carver, to see your efforts claimed by another." The older woman's tone was sympathetic, almost maternal, but her eyes were unyielding, watching for the smallest crack in Dr. Carver's composure. The botanist's jaw tightened, and she leaned forward slightly, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. "Hurt? I was furious," she admitted, her voice low but fierce. "Cedric and I collaborated years ago, but he betrayed me. He published our findings under his name alone, and now this orchid, my orchid, was to be his crowning glory. I confronted him, yes, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft sound a counterpoint to the rising tension. She thought of a spinster in St. Mary Mead, Miss Elspeth, who had once harboured a bitter grudge against a rival seamstress for stealing a pattern, her envy festering until it erupted in a public outburst. Envy, Miss Marple knew, was a poison that could drive one to desperate acts. "You confronted him," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "When was this, Dr. Carver?" The botanist hesitated, her grey eyes flickering with something that might have been unease. "The evening before his death," she said at last. "Around 8 in the greenhouse. He was working on that wretched plant as usual. I demanded he acknowledge my contribution, but he laughed, and said I had no proof. I left him there, alive." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the handkerchief, the fabric nearly tearing under the strain. Inspector Crane made a note, his pencil scratching loudly. "And you didn't return to the greenhouse later?" he pressed. Dr. Carver's gaze snapped to him, her expression icy. "I told you, I was in my room. Ask the maid. She brought me tea at 9. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught a faint quiver, a note of defensiveness that lingered like a misplaced chord. She recalled the small footprint in the greenhouse soil, the size of a woman's shoe, and wondered if Dr. Carver's elegant heels might match it. "You must know the greenhouse well," Miss Marple said, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "Visiting it often, as you did." Dr. Carver's eyes narrowed, and she straightened, her posture almost regal. "I visited when necessary," she said. "Cedric's work was built on mine, so I had every right to see what he was doing with my ideas. That orchid was the culmination of years of my research, its properties, its potential. He had no right to claim it." Her voice rose, a note of passion breaking through her restraint, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands trembled, as if the weight of her grievance was too much to bear. "And what properties did this orchid possess?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. Dr. Carver hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "Cedric kept that close," she said finally. "He was secretive, even with me. But I know it was extraordinary, something about a compound that could revolutionize medicine. He was close to isolating it, or so he claimed." Her tone was bitter, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the green smudge on her cuff. A faint echo of the ink smudged on the orchid's label in the greenhouse. Inspector Crane flipped a page in his notebook. "You say you had no proof of your claim to the orchid," he said, "but did you ever try to take it? Or perhaps something from that locked cabinet in the potting shed?" Dr. Carver's face flushed, and she stood abruptly, her handkerchief falling to the floor. "That's preposterous," she snapped. "I'm a scientist, not a thief. I wouldn't stoop to Cedric's level." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way her gaze darted to the side, as if the mention of the cabinet had struck a nerve. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead schoolteacher, whose envy of a colleague's promotion had led to a pilfered exam paper, discovered only when a student noticed her trembling hands. Miss Marple leaned forward, retrieving the handkerchief with a graceful motion, and offering it back to Dr. Carver. "You must have felt terribly wronged," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "To lose such a discovery to another, it would try anyone's patience." Dr. Carver took the handkerchief, her fingers brushing Miss Marple's, and for a moment her guard seemed to falter. "It was my life's work," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, "and he took it without a thought." Then, as if catching herself, she straightened, her expression hardening. "But I didn't kill him. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction." Inspector Crane closed his notebook with a snap. "We'll need to speak with you again, Doctor. Carver," he said, "don't leave the manor." She nodded curtly, her eyes flashing with defiance, and strode from the conservatory, her heels clicking sharply on the tiles. As the door closed, Miss Marple turned to the inspector, her knitting needles still moving steadily. "A woman of great conviction," she said softly, "but also great resentment. Envy, Inspector, is a fire that burns slowly but fiercely." Crane frowned, rubbing his chin. "You think she's lying about her alibi?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost wistful. "I think, Inspector, that Dr. Carver carries a wound that runs deep. Her anger at Dr. Hawthorne was no fleeting thing. It has roots. That green smudge on her cuff, the way she spoke of the orchid's properties. She knows more than she admits. And that cabinet, it seems to draw everyone's attention, doesn't it?" She paused, her eyes drifting to the conservatory's windows, where the greenhouse's silhouette loomed in the distance. "We must see what Molly Green has to say. A gardener, you know, often sees what others miss." As they prepared to summon the next suspect, Miss Marple's mind turned over Doctor. Carver's words, her hesitations, her barely concealed rage. She thought of the footprint in the greenhouse, the torn notebook page, and the locked cabinet that seemed to hold the key to so many secrets. Envy, she reflected, was a motive as old as time, and Dr. Carver's burned brightly. Whether it had flared into murder, however, was a question yet to be answered. Chapter 6. The Gardener's Secret. The potting shed at Thornfield Manor was a humble structure, tucked behind the greenhouse like an afterthought, its weathered wooden walls stained with years of soil and sap. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of peat and compost, and shelves groaned under the weight of clay pots, seed trays, and rusted tools. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the doorway, her sensible shoes careful to avoid the scattered dirt on the floor, her knitting bag tucked under one arm. The morning light filtered through a small, grimy window, illuminating Molly Green, the young gardener, who stood nervously by a workbench, her hands clasped tightly before her. She was a slight figure, no more than 20, with freckled cheeks and hair the colour of straw, tied back with a frayed ribbon. Her apron was smeared with earth, and her nails bore the telltale grime of her trade. But it was her eyes, wide and wary, like those of a startled doe, that drew Miss Marple's attention. Inspector Crane leaned against the doorframe, his broad frame blocking much of the light, his notebook already open in his hand. "Miss Green," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We need to know what you saw the night Dr. Hawthorne was killed. No holding back." Molly's gaze flicked to him, then to Miss Marple, and she nodded, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "I'll tell you what I can, sir," she said, her voice soft, with a faint country lilt that reminded Miss Marple of the girls in St. Mary Mead. "It's a terrible thing what happened to Dr. Hawthorne. He was good to me, always patient, even when I mixed up the plant names." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as warm as a village hearth. "You must have learned a great deal from him, Molly," she said, settling onto a stool near the workbench, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with their familiar click-click. "A gardener's work is so vital, isn't it? Tending life, watching it grow." Molly's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded, a shy smile breaking through her unease. "Aye, ma'am. Dr. Hawthorne said I had a knack for it. He trusted me with the greenhouse, even the special plants like that orchid." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "The Orchidaceae ignota," she said, as if merely confirming a fact. "A remarkable plant by all accounts. Did you tend to it often?" Molly's smile faded, and her hands stilled on her apron. "Not often, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Hawthorne was particular about that one. He'd water it himself, check it every day. I just kept the soil turned, made sure the other plants didn't crowd it." Her eyes darted to the floor, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers resumed their nervous twisting, as if she were uprooting some hidden thought. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dirt floor. "You were in the greenhouse that night, weren't you? Around 10, you said, fetching tools for Dr. Hawthorne?" Molly nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, sir. He asked for a trowel and some twine. I brought them from the shed, left them on the workbench, and went back to my room in the servants' quarters. I didn't see nothing else." Her words tumbled out, too fast, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze lingering on the girl's flushed face. She thought of young Elsie, a maid in St. Mary Mead, whose hurried denials had hidden a stolen brooch, revealed only when a neighbour noticed her furtive glances. "You must see a great deal, working in the greenhouse," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. "People coming and going, perhaps. Dr. Carver, or Mr. Finch, or even Sir Reginald." Molly's eyes widened, and she shook her head, her ribbon slipping slightly. "I don't pry, ma'am," she said. "I just do my work. Dr. Carver was there sometimes, looking at the orchid. Mr. Finch, too. He was always with Dr. Hawthorne, writing things down. Sir Reginald, he didn't come often, but when he did, he'd talk loud, about money." Her voice faltered, and she bit her lip, as if regretting her words. Inspector Crane's pencil scratched in his notebook. "And after 10, you didn't go back to the greenhouse?" he asked, his tone sharp. Molly shook her head again, more firmly this time. "No, sir. I was in bed. The other servants can tell you, I was up early before the body was found." Her voice broke, and she looked down, her hands gripping the workbench. Miss Marple noted a small cut on her finger, fresh and red, as if made by a sharp edge. She recalled the bent trowel in the greenhouse, its blade slightly askew, and wondered if Molly's duties had included more than fetching tools. "You cared for Dr. Hawthorne, didn't you?" Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "He must have been a kind employer." Molly's eyes glistened, and she nodded. He was, ma'am. Never raised his voice, not like some. He'd explain things, teach me about the plants. Said I could be a proper botanist one day if I studied. Her voice held a note of pride, but also a tremor, as if the memory pained her. Miss Marple's mind turned to a St. Mary Mead gardener, a lad who had adored his master but stolen apples to impress a friend. Loyalty, she knew, could coexist with small betrayals. "And the orchid?" Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking softly. "Did you ever touch it, or perhaps notice anything unusual about it?" Molly's flush deepened, and her hands dropped to her sides, hidden in the folds of her apron. "No, ma'am," she said quickly. "I told you, Doctor, Hawthorne looked after it himself. I wouldn't touch it without his say-so." Her words were firm, but her eyes flickered, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze, and the older woman noted the faint tremble in her voice, like a leaf caught in a breeze. Inspector Crane moved closer, his shadow falling across the workbench. "What about that locked cabinet in the potting shed?" he asked. "Did you ever see Dr. Hawthorne open it?" Molly's head jerked up, her eyes wide with alarm. "The cabinet?" "No, sir. That was his private things. Notes, he said. He kept the key with him. Always." Her voice was steady now, but Miss Marple caught the way her fingers brushed against her apron pocket, as if checking for something. She thought of the small brass key found in the greenhouse, its surface scratched, and wondered if Molly's duties had ever brought her close to it. "You must know the greenhouse better than most," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as ever. "Attention. All those paths, those hidden corners. Did you ever see anything out of place that night? A tool left where it shouldn't be, perhaps? Or someone lingering where they didn't belong?" Molly hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. I don't recall, ma'am," she said at last. "It was dark and I was quick about my errand. I didn't stay." Her voice was soft, but Miss Marple sensed a guardedness, a wall of silence erected to protect something, or someone. Inspector Crane closed his notebook with a snap. "We'll need to speak with you again, Miss Green," he said. "Stay close to the manor." Molly nodded, her eyes still fixed on the floor, and slipped out of the shed, her footsteps light, but hurried. As the door creaked shut, Miss Marple turned to the inspector, her knitting needles still moving steadily. "A nervous girl," she said softly, "but not without courage. She knows more than she says, Inspector, though whether it's about the orchid or something else, I cannot yet tell." Crane frowned, rubbing his chin. "You think she's covering for someone?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost wistful. "I think, Inspector, that Molly Green is like a young plant, caught between sun and shadow. Her loyalty to Dr. Hawthorne is clear, but there's a fear in her eyes, a secret she guards. That cut on her finger, the way she spoke of the cabinet. She's closer to this mystery than she admits." She paused, her eyes drifting to the shed's window, where the greenhouse's glass roof shimmered in the distance. "We must look to the others, but also to the small things, the tools, the key, the soil. They will tell us what Molly cannot." As they stepped out of the shed, the morning air cool against their faces, Miss Marple's mind turned over Molly's hesitations, her quick denials, her guarded glances. She thought of the footprint in the greenhouse, the bent trowel, and the locked cabinet that seemed to draw everyone's attention. Secrets, she reflected, were like weeds in a garden, tenacious, hidden, and always ready to spread. Whether Molly's secret was one of guilt or fear, Miss Marple was determined to unearth it. Chapter 7. The Clues in the Soil. The midday sun hung low over Thornfield Manor, its rays filtering through the greenhouse's glass panes to cast a mosaic of light and shadow across the flagstone paths. Miss Jane Marple returned to the scene of Dr. Hawthorne's murder, her steps deliberate, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The humid air enveloped her, heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids, and she paused to adjust her shawl, her knitting bag a familiar weight under her arm. Inspector Crane followed, his boots scuffing softly against the stones, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild exasperation. "Back here again, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with the weariness of a man who preferred straightforward evidence to the subtleties of observation. "What do you hope to find that we haven't already?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, her needles emerging from her bag with their customary click-click. "The smallest things, Inspector," she said softly, "often tell the loudest stories. A greenhouse, you see, is like a village. It keeps its secrets close, but they are there for those who know where to look." She moved toward the workbench, where Dr. Hawthorne had met his end, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered surface with the precision of a botanist examining a specimen. The blood-stained soil beneath had been cordoned off by the police, but the workbench itself remained untouched, a chaotic still life of tools, vials, and notebooks. She bent closer, her fingers hovering over a pair of pruning shears. Not the murder weapon, which was safely in police custody, but a similar pair, their blades flecked with sap. Beside them lay a small trowel, its handle worn smooth, its tip slightly bent, as if it had been used to pry something open. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a leather-bound notebook, its pages splayed to reveal Dr. Hawthorne's meticulous sketches of plants, their Latin names inscribed in his angular hand. One page, however, caught her attention. A corner torn away, the jagged edge smudged with green ink, as if the tear had been made in haste. "This notebook," she said, pointing without touching. "Have you examined its contents thoroughly, Inspector?" Crane stepped forward, frowning. "We've looked through it," he said. "Mostly plant diagrams and formulas. Nothing obvious about the murder. That torn page, though, we haven't found the missing piece." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the smudge of green ink she had noticed on the Orchidaceae ignotus label and on Dr. Carver's cuff. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead librarian, whose torn ledger had revealed a pilfered book when the missing page was found in a rival's desk. "A torn page," she murmured, "is like a broken promise. It leaves a trace." Her gaze shifted to a small glass vial, half hidden beneath a tray of seed packets, its amber contents catching the light. It was not the vial she had taken earlier for analysis, but another, its cork stopper slightly askew. "Another of Dr. Hawthorne's experiments?" she asked, her tone mild but curious. Crane crouched to inspect it, his brow furrowing. Could be. He was always mixing plant extracts, according to Finch. I'll have it sent to the lab. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Do, Inspector. A plant's secrets, like a person's, can be potent in the wrong hands." She moved to the soil beneath the workbench, where the faint footprint she had noticed before remained, its edges still sharp in the soft earth. It was small, likely a woman's, and she thought of Molly Green's nervous demeanour and Dr. Carver's elegant heels. "This footprint," she said, pointing, "it's undisturbed, isn't it? No one has walked here since the murder." Crane nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We've kept the area clear. could belong to Molly or Doctor, Carver, or even a visitor we don't know about. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving connections. Or someone who knew the greenhouse well enough to step carefully, she said, her voice almost a whisper. She walked slowly along the greenhouse paths, her eyes scanning the rows of plants. Near the garden entrance, a cluster of ferns bore signs of disturbance, their fronds bent as if someone had brushed past in a hurry. A single leaf, caught on a trellis, was smeared with a dark substance. Mud, perhaps, or something more sinister. Miss Marple paused, her fingers brushing the leaf lightly, and noted its texture, slightly sticky, as if it had been touched by a hand coated in sap or blood. She thought of the frayed twine in the potting shed, the bent trowel, and the key found near the workbench. Each clue, she knew, was a fragment of a larger truth, like petals scattered from a single bloom. At the potting shed entrance, she stopped, her gaze falling on a small wooden crate tucked beneath a shelf. It was unremarkable, save for a faint scratch on its lid, as if it had been pried open and hastily closed. "Inspector," she said, pointing, "have you looked inside this crate?" Crane followed her gaze, his expression skeptical. "Just gardening supplies, I expect," he said. But he moved to open it, revealing a jumble of twine, gloves, and a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch was a single seed, its surface glossy and black, unlike any Miss Marple had seen. "Curious," she said softly. "Dr. Hawthorne was a man of secrets, wasn't he?" Crane bagged the seed for evidence, his patience visibly thinning. "You see clues everywhere, Miss Marple," he said, half in jest. "But what do they mean?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet certainty. "They mean, Inspector, that someone was here in haste or stealth and left traces of their purpose. The footprint, the torn page, the seed, they are like whispers, telling us what happened that night." She paused, her gaze drifting to the Orchidaceae ignota, its violet petals glowing faintly under the glass roof. "This orchid," she continued, "was Dr. Hawthorne's triumph, but also his danger. Someone coveted it, not just for its beauty, but for what it promised." She stepped back to the workbench, her fingers hovering over a small brass magnifying glass, its handle engraved with Dr. Hawthorne's initials. It was clean, but its position, slightly askew, as if dropped and replaced, suggested it had been used recently. "Did Dr. Hawthorne often work with this?" she asked. Crane shrugged. "Finch said he used it to examine specimens. Nothing unusual there." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was racing. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead jeweller, whose magnifying glass had revealed a stolen gem hidden in plain sight. Tools, she thought, were as telling as the hands that wielded them. As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the locked cabinet in the potting shed, its door unyielding despite the key found nearby. "Have you tried the key in this lock?" she asked, her tone deceptively casual. Crane shook his head. "Not yet. It's on my list, but the cabinet's sturdy. Might need a locksmith." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was alight with possibilities. "A locked cabinet," she said, "is like a closed heart, Inspector. It holds its secrets tightly, but they will come to light." They stepped into the garden, the cool air a sharp contrast to the greenhouse's warmth. Miss Marple glanced back at the glass structure, its panes reflecting the sky like a mirror. "We have spoken to them all now," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Arthur Finch, with his devotion, Sir Reginald, with his ambition, Dr. Carver, with her envy, and Molly Green with her secrets. Each has a piece of this puzzle, but the greenhouse holds the rest. She thought of the clues, the footprint, the torn page, the vial, the seed, and felt the pattern beginning to form, like a plant taking shape from scattered seeds. Inspector Crane rubbed his chin, his skepticism softening slightly. "You've got a way of seeing things, Miss Marple," he said, "but we need more than clues. We need proof." She nodded, her needles clicking once more. "Proof, Inspector, is like a flower. It blooms when the time is right. We must be patient, but watchful." As they walked toward the manor, Miss Marple's mind turned over the morning's discoveries, each a thread in the tapestry of murder. The greenhouse, she knew, was more than a crime scene. It was a stage, and the clues in its soil were the script of a killer's intent. Chapter 8. A village parallel. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Thornfield Manor's parlour, casting delicate patterns across the rosewood table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a quiet counterpoint to the chill that lingered in the air, not from the autumn day, but from the shadow of murder that hung over the manor. Lady Beatrice Langley, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, poured tea from a porcelain pot, her hands steady despite the strain in her eyes. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "this dreadful business with Cedric, it's turned the house upside down. The servants whisper, the guests tiptoe about, and I feel as though that the very walls are watching us." Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, her blue eyes gentle but piercing, as she accepted a cup of tea. "Murder, my dear Beatrice," she said softly, "has a way of unsettling even the sturdiest foundations. But it is in the whispers, the glances, that we find the truth." She sipped her tea, her mind turning over the morning's discoveries in the greenhouse. The torn notebook page, the smudged green ink, the small footprint, the mysterious seed in its leather pouch. Each clue was a piece of a puzzle, and she felt it beginning to take shape, like a garden slowly revealing its design. Lady Beatrice leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You've spoken to them all now, haven't you? Arthur, Sir Reginald, Dr. Carver, and young Molly. What do you make of them?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click-click blending with the fire's crackle. "They are a curious group," she said, her tone as calm as if discussing the weather. "Each has a motive, you see, though they wear it differently. Arthur Finch's devotion to Dr. Hawthorne is almost too perfect, like a rose too carefully pruned. Sir Reginald's ambition burns brightly, but it blinds him to subtler truths. Dr. Carver's envy is a fire that consumes her. And Molly Green, well, she hides something like a seedling buried too deep to sprout." Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, and she set her teacup down with a faint clink. "You think one of them did it?" she asked. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost wistful. "I think, Beatrice, that people are never quite what they seem. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once knew a seamstress, Miss Elspeth, who was the soul of kindness, until a rival won a prize for a dress she claimed as her own. Her envy turned to spite, and she sabotaged her rival's work, cutting threads in a gown meant for a grand occasion. It was a small act, but it taught me that envy, when nurtured, can grow into something far darker." She paused, her eyes drifting to the window, where the greenhouse's glass roof shimmered in the distance. Dr. Hawthorne's orchid, I suspect, was such a prize. Lady Beatrice frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of her saucer. You think the orchid is at the heart of this? Miss Marple nodded, her needles never faltering. It is more than a plant, Beatrice. It is a promise of wealth, of fame, of triumph. Someone wanted it, not just for its beauty, but for what it could bring. And that desire, I believe, led to murder. She thought of the clues in the greenhouse, the footprint that might belong to Molly or Dr. Carver, the torn page with its green ink, the vial of amber liquid, the seed in its hidden pouch. Each was a whisper, and she was listening closely. Lady Beatrice leaned back, her expression troubled. I've seen things, Jane, these past weeks. Dr. Carver was often in the greenhouse, uninvited, peering at that orchid as if it were her own child. And Sir Reginald, oh, he'd storm in, demanding progress, waving his cigar like a sceptre. Arthur was always there, hovering like a shadow. And Molly, she's so quiet, but I've caught her watching the others, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her smile remained serene. Watching, you say? She murmured. A gardener sees much, Beatrice, just as a village spinster does. The trick is knowing what to make of it. She set her teacup down, her mind drifting to another parallel from St. Mary Mead. There had been a grocer, Mr. Tuttle, whose loyalty to his employer had seemed unshakable, until a missing ledger revealed he'd been skimming profits to fund a secret venture. His devotion, like Arthur's, had been a mask, and Miss Marple wondered if the young assistant's loyalty hid a similar ambition. She thought, too, of Sir Reginald's bluster, so like the squire who had bullied his tenants while hiding his own debts. And Dr. Carver's bitterness, how it echoed Miss Elspeth's, but with a sharper edge, honed by years of professional rivalry. Molly's nervousness, meanwhile, reminded her of a kitchen maid who had known of a theft but feared to speak. Her silence bought by loyalty or fear. Beatrice, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, have you noticed anything unusual about the greenhouse itself? Tools out of place, perhaps, or signs of someone lingering after hours? Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers smoothing her skirt. Now that you mention it, she said, the gardener's boy mentioned a light in the greenhouse late one night, a week or so ago. He thought it was Dr. Hawthorne, but it was well past midnight, and Cedric usually retired by then. I didn't think much of it at the time. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained placid. A light in the dark, she said, is like a word spoken out of turn. It draws attention. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she gathered her knitting. I think, Beatrice, that we must look again at the greenhouse, and at those who move within it. The clues are there, waiting to be read, like a book left open on a table. Lady Beatrice nodded, her face pale but resolute. You'll stay, won't you, Jane? Until this is solved. Miss Marple's smile was warm, but her eyes held a quiet determination. Of course, my dear. A mystery, like a garden, must be tended until it yields its secrets. As Lady Beatrice rang for the maid to clear the tea, Miss Marple's mind turned over the threads of the case. The torn page, the footprint, the seed, the vial, each was a clue, but it was the people she knew who held the key. Arthur's trembling hands, Sir Reginald's booming impatience, Dr. Carver's icy rage, Molly's guarded glances, they were like the plants in Dr. Hawthorne's greenhouse, each with its own needs, its own dangers. She thought of the locked cabinet in the potting shed, mentioned by Arthur and Sir Reginald, and the key found near the workbench, its surface scratched as if handled in haste. Envy, she murmured to herself, her needles clicking softly, is a weed that chokes the heart. But which heart, I wonder? As she prepared to join Inspector Crane for the next stage of their inquiry, Miss Marple felt the pattern of the crime beginning to emerge, faint but growing clearer, like a flower bud ready to unfurl. The greenhouse, she knew, was the heart of this mystery, and its soil held more than clues. It held the truth of a killer's intent. Chapter 9. The Orchid's Value. The afternoon sun dipped lower over Thornfield Manor, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and bathing the greenhouse in a golden glow that made its glass panes shimmer like liquid amber. Miss Jane Marple sat in the manor's small study, a cosy room lined with books and furnished with a single desk, where she had requested a moment of quiet to make a telephone call. Her knitting needles rested in her lap, silent for once, as she waited for the operator to connect her to Dr. Percival Thorn, an old acquaintance and botanist of some repute who resided in London. The line crackled, and his voice, warm but tinged with scholarly distraction, came through. "Jane, my dear, what a surprise," Dr. Thorn said. "To what do I owe this call?" "Not another of your village intrigues, I hope." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, though her eyes remained sharp behind her spectacles. "Something rather more serious, I'm afraid, Percival," she replied, her voice soft but precise. "I'm at Thornfield Manor, where Dr. Cedric Hawthorne has met an untimely end. I need to know about a plant, an orchid, Orchidaceae ignota. What can you tell me of its value?" There was a pause, followed by a low whistle. "Orchidaceae ignota? Good heavens, Jane, that's no ordinary bloom. Cedric was working on it for years, and the rumours in botanical circles are extraordinary. It's said to produce a compound with medicinal properties, possibly a paralytic agent, but one that could be refined into a treatment for neurological disorders. If true, it's worth millions, not just for science, but for the pharmaceutical industry. Cedric was tight-lipped, but word was he was close to a breakthrough." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind turning to the amber vial she had found in the greenhouse, now safely in the hands of the local chemist for analysis. "A paralytic agent," she murmured. "Most intriguing. And would others in the field know of this?" "Oh, certainly," Dr. Thorn replied. "Evelyn Carver, for one. She and Cedric were collaborators once, though they fell out bitterly. She'd have known its potential, perhaps better than anyone. And Cedric's funder, that Voss fellow, was pushing to commercialize it. Even his assistant, young Finch, would have had an inkling, handling Cedric's notes as he did." Miss Marple thanked him, her voice warm, but her thoughts racing and hung up. The pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind like petals caught in a breeze. She made her way to the village chemist, a small shop in the nearby hamlet of Thornfield, Cross, its shelves lined with bottles and jars that gleamed in the dim light. Mr. Hargrove, the chemist, a wiry man with a meticulous air, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've analysed that vial you sent over." Curious stuff. An extract likely from an orchid, given its chemical profile. It's potent, all right. In small doses, it could numb a limb. In larger ones, it might stop a heart. Dangerous if mishandled. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind seized on the word paralytic. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Might it be from Orchidaceae ignota?" He shrugged, adjusting his spectacles. "Could be. I'd need the plant itself to be sure, but it matches what I've read of such compounds." Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Crane, who was in the drawing room, reviewing witness statements with a furrowed brow. "Any progress, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone a mix of hope and scepticism. She settled into a chair, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "A step closer, Inspector," she said. "The orchid is indeed the heart of this matter. Its value is not merely scientific, but financial. Millions, perhaps, for the right buyer. And its extract, I've learned, could be deadly in the wrong hands." Crane's eyes widened, and he leaned forward. "Deadly? You think the killer used it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I think, Inspector, that the orchid's promise drew someone to act. Whether with shears or something subtler we cannot yet say. But we must speak again to Arthur Finch. His hands, you see, shook when we mentioned the orchid, and he spoke of Dr. Hawthorne's agitation. He knows something of its secrets." They found Arthur in the library, poring over a stack of Dr. Hawthorne's notebooks, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as they entered, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "we've learned something of the orchid's value. A remarkable plant, with properties that could change lives or end them. Did Dr. Hawthorne ever speak of its dangers?" Arthur's hands froze on the notebook, and a bead of sweat glistened on his brow. "Dangers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He mentioned it could be potent, yes. He was careful with it, always wore gloves when handling the extract. But I didn't know the details, only what he wrote in his notes." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his trembling fingers, noting a faint stain of green ink on his thumb, similar to that on the torn notebook page. "And those notes," she said, "did they include the formula for this extract?" Arthur's gaze darted to the side, and he pushed his spectacles up with a shaky hand. "Some of them, yes," he admitted, "but the private ones, in the locked cabinet, I never saw those. He kept them separate." His voice was earnest, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes, like a shadow passing over a pond. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his notebook open. "You were close to his work, Finch," he said, "close enough to know what that orchid was worth. Did you ever think of taking it for yourself?" Arthur's face flushed, and he stood abruptly, knocking a pencil to the floor. "Take it? Never! I loved Dr. Hawthorne's work. I'd have died for it." His voice broke, and tears welled in his eyes, but Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, noting the intensity of his words, the almost desperate fervour. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead curate, whose devotion to his vicar had hidden a secret longing for recognition, revealed only when a stolen sermon came to light. "You loved his work," she said softly, "and perhaps you saw its potential too. Did anyone else show such interest? Dr. Carver, perhaps?" Arthur's shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair. "She was obsessed," he said, his voice low, "always asking about the orchid, trying to read his notes. She'd come to the greenhouse at odd hours, claiming she had a right to it. And Sir Reginald, he kept pressing Dr. Hawthorne to sell it, saying it was time to cash in." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "And Molly Green?" she asked. Arthur hesitated, his fingers brushing the ink stain on his thumb. She was curious but quiet. She'd watch the orchid sometimes when she thought no one saw. As they left Arthur, Miss Marple turned to Crane, her expression serene, but her mind alight with connections. "The orchid's value," she said, is a magnet, drawing greed, envy, ambition. Arthur knows more than he admits, Inspector, but his fear suggests he's protecting something, or someone. She thought of the vial, the torn page, the footprint and the seed, each a clue pointing to the orchid's deadly allure. "We must press on," she said, "for the truth, like a rare bloom, requires careful tending." Crane nodded, his skepticism softening. "You're building a case, Miss Marple," he said, "but we need more than theories." Her smile was gentle, almost maternal. "We need only to follow the roots, Inspector. They will lead us to the flower, and to the hand that plucked it." As they walked toward the manor's hall, Miss Marple's mind turned to the locked cabinet, the key, and the secrets that lay buried in the greenhouse's soil, waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 10. The Night's Shadows. The twilight settled over Thornfield Manor like a velvet cloak, softening the edges of the sprawling estate, and casting the greenhouse in a silvery glow that made its glass panes shimmer with an almost spectral light. Miss Jane Marple stood on the garden path, her shawl drawn tightly against the evening chill, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of late roses, and the sharper tang of turned earth from the nearby beds. She had requested a moment alone to retrace the greenhouse's paths, to let the scene of Dr. Hawthorne's murder speak to her in its quiet, shadowed language. Inspector Crane had grumbled but acquiesced, retreating to the manor to review his notes, leaving Miss Marple to her solitary musings. She stepped into the greenhouse, the humid warmth enveloping her like a breath, the scent of orchids and damp soil thick in the air. The orchid Osea ignota stood on the workbench, its violet petals catching the last of the daylight, glowing with an almost defiant vitality. Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept the space, noting the familiar clues, the blood-stained soil, now dry and cordoned off, the torn notebook page with its smudge of green ink, the small footprint in the earth, its edges still sharp. But it was the silence of the greenhouse that struck her most, a silence that seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to uncover its secrets. She walked slowly along the flagstone paths, her sensible shoes silent, her mind turning over the witness statements Inspector Crane had shared earlier that day. A maid, polishing silver in the pantry, had glimpsed Dr. Evelyn Carver near the greenhouse at 11 o'clock, her silhouette fleeting against the glass. A groundskeeper, tending a bonfire, had overheard Sir Reginald Voss arguing with Dr. Hawthorne in the library at 9, their voices raised over money and the orchid's future. Molly Green had admitted to fetching a trowel and twine for Dr. Hawthorne at 10, leaving the greenhouse shortly after. Arthur Finch claimed he had departed at midnight, his work on the botanist's notes complete. Yet no one had seen the murder itself, estimated at 1 in the morning, when the pruning shears found their deadly mark. Miss Marple paused by the workbench, her fingers hovering over the magnifying glass she had noticed earlier, its handle engraved with Dr. Hawthorne's initials. It lay slightly askew, as if replaced in haste, and she wondered who had used it last. Dr. Hawthorne, examining his prized orchid, or someone else, searching for something hidden. She thought of the small brass key, found half buried under seed catalogues, its surface scratched as if dropped in a moment of panic. The locked cabinet in the potting shed, mentioned by Arthur and Sir Reginald, loomed in her mind, its contents still a mystery. She had urged Inspector Crane to test the key, but he had yet to report back, delayed by a locksmith's absence. Her gaze drifted to the small footprint, its size suggesting a woman's shoe. Molly's, perhaps, or Dr. Carver's. She recalled Molly's nervous glance in the potting shed, the cut on her finger, and Dr. Carver's icy bitterness, the green smudge on her cuff. Both women had been near the greenhouse, but their denials rang with different notes. Molly's tinged with fear, Dr. Carver's with defiance. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture that might have been mistaken for disapproval but was, in truth, the seed of a thought taking root. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead shop girl, whose furtive glances had hidden a stolen ribbon, discovered only when a customer noticed her trembling hands. People, she knew, betrayed themselves in the smallest ways. She moved to the garden entrance, where the disturbed ferns still bore signs of a hurried passage, their fronds bent and smeared with a dark, sticky substance. Kneeling carefully, her shawl brushing the soil, she examined the leaf she had noticed before, its edge crusted with what might have been blood or sap. She slipped it into a handkerchief, tucking it into her bag for later inspection. The greenhouse's 4 entrances, each unguarded, each a silent invitation, nagged at her. Someone had entered unseen, struck with precision, and left no trace but a footprint and a wiped-clean handle. "A careful hand," she murmured, "but not careful enough." She walked to the potting shed entrance, where the frayed twine still lay coiled on the floor, its end cut sharply as if by a blade. Nearby, the wooden crate with its scratched lid held the memory of the glossy black seed, now in police custody. Miss Marple's mind turned to the amber vial, its paralytic contents confirmed by the chemist, and the orchid's rumoured value. Millions, Dr. Thorn had said, for its medicinal promise. She thought of Arthur's trembling hands, Sir Reginald's booming impatience, Dr. Carver's bitter envy, and Molly's guarded silence. Each had a motive, but the greenhouse held the truth, its paths and shadows a map of the killer's intent. As the last light faded, Miss Marple stood by the Orchidaceae ignota, its petals seeming to pulse in the dimness. "You," she whispered, as if addressing the plant itself, "are the heart of this." "But whose heart did you break?" She recalled a saint. Mary Mead widow, whose obsession with a rare rose had led to a feud with a neighbour, resolved only when a stolen cutting was found in her shed. Desire, Miss Marple knew, could twist even the gentlest soul, and the orchid's allure was no ordinary bloom. She turned as Inspector Crane's heavy footsteps approached, his silhouette filling the doorway. "Found anything, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice gruff but curious. She smiled, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Shadows, Inspector," she said, "and the traces they leave." The night of the murder was full of movement. Dr. Carver near the greenhouse, Sir Reginald's argument, Molly's errand, Arthur's late work. Yet the hour of one remains dark. We must light it with what we know. Crane rubbed his chin, his skepticism tempered by her quiet certainty. "The key didn't fit the cabinet," he said. "We tried it this afternoon. It's for something else. Maybe a desk or a box in the manor." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "A key without a lock," she said, "is like a word without meaning. We must find its place, Inspector, for it will open more than a door." She thought of the torn page, the green ink, the seed and the footprint, each a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. As they left the greenhouse, the night closed in, the manor's lights glowing warmly in the distance. Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities, each clue a step closer to the truth. "The night's shadows," she said softly, "hide the guilty, but they also reveal them. We must gather our suspects, Inspector, and see what light they cast." Her needles clicked steadily, a rhythm as sure as her resolve, as she prepared to unravel the mystery that lay buried in the greenhouse's silent earth. Chapter 11. The Trap. The evening air in Thornfield Manor's greenhouse was thick with the scent of orchids and damp earth, the glass panes reflecting the soft glow of lanterns hung along the flagstone paths. Miss Jane Marple stood near the workbench, her slight figure almost lost in the shadows, her knitting bag resting at her feet. The Orchidaceae ignota gleamed under the lamplight, its violet petals a silent witness to the drama about to unfold. She had proposed this gathering to Inspector Crane, a carefully staged moment to draw out the truth, and he had agreed, albeit with a sceptical grunt. The suspects, Arthur Finch, Sir Reginald Voss, Dr. Evelyn Carver, and Molly Green, stood in a tense semicircle, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, each betraying a mix of unease and defiance. Inspector Crane stood beside Miss Marple, his broad shoulders squared, his notebook tucked away as if to signal that this was no ordinary interview. The manor's butler hovered near the garden entrance, ready to summon assistance if needed, while Lady Beatrice Langley watched from a wicker chair, her silver hair catching the light like a halo. Miss Marple's blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved from face to face, noting Arthur's trembling hands, Sir Reginald's restless tugging at his watch chain, Dr. Carver's tightly clenched jaw, and Molly's downcast gaze, her fingers twisting her apron. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as a village vicar's, yet carrying a quiet authority that stilled the room. "We are gathered here, in the very place where Dr. Cedric Hawthorne met his end, to uncover the truth. This orchid," she gestured to the Orchidaceae ignota, "was his triumph, but also his downfall. It promised wealth, fame, perhaps even miracles, but it also inspired a motive dark enough to lead to murder." Her words hung in the air, and she noted the quick glances exchanged among the suspects, like ripples on a pond disturbed by a stone. Sir Reginald broke the silence, his voice booming. "This is absurd! I've told you I was in my study, nowhere near this place when Rex System. I'm sorry, it looks like the response was cut off." Let me complete chapter 11 for you, continuing in the Agatha Christie style, ensuring no repetitions and maintaining the narrative flow. Place when Cedric was killed, huh? His face reddened, and he tugged sharply at his watch chain, the gold links clinking in the quiet greenhouse. "You're wasting time pointing fingers at me, when the real culprit is likely standing among us." His eyes darted toward Dr. Carver, a flicker of accusation in his gaze. Miss Marple's needles, which she had retrieved from her bag, resumed their soft click-click, a steady rhythm that seemed to anchor the tension-filled room. "Indeed, Sir Reginald," she said, her tone calm but piercing, "the truth is here, in this very circle. But let us consider the facts. Dr. Hawthorne was killed at 1 a.m, with pruning shears, the handle wiped clean. A footprint, small and sharp, was left in the soil." She paused, her eyes resting briefly on Molly and Dr. Carver, whose shoes might fit the mark. A page was torn from his notebook, smudged with green ink. A vial of paralytic extract, likely from this orchid, was found nearby, and a single black seed, hidden in a pouch, suggests secrets yet to be uncovered. Molly Green's hands tightened on her apron, her freckled cheeks paling, while Arthur Finch adjusted his spectacles, his fingers trembling. Dr. Carver's grey eyes flashed with defiance, and she stepped forward, her voice sharp as cut glass. "If you're implying I had anything to do with this, you're gravely mistaken," she said. "I was in my room, as I've said. I'd not ruin my career for a plant, no matter its value." Her handkerchief twisted in her hands, and Miss Marple noted the faint green smudge on her cuff, a silent echo of the ink on the torn page. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was razor-sharp. "Not just any plant, Dr. Carver," she said gently. "This orchid was your triumph, was it not? A discovery you believed doctor. Hawthorne stole from you. Its value, millions perhaps in medicinal promise, would have restored your reputation." She turned to the group, her voice steady. "But let us consider the night's movements. A maid saw Dr. Carver near the greenhouse at 11. Sir Reginald argued with Doctor. Hawthorne at 9, over money and the orchid sale. Molly fetched tools at 10, and Arthur worked until midnight. Yet, at 1, someone entered, struck, and vanished into the shadows." She stepped closer to the workbench, her fingers brushing the air above the Orchidaceae ignota. "This plant," she said, "was the heart of it all. Its extract, as I've learned, could paralyze or kill if mishandled. Did someone know this? Did someone use it, perhaps to weaken Dr. Hawthorne before the fatal blow?" Her eyes swept the group, noting Arthur's sudden stillness, Sir Reginald's bluster faltering, Molly's gaze dropping to her feet, and Dr. Carver's lips parting as if to protest. Inspector Crane, sensing the moment's weight, stepped forward. "Miss Marple's right," he said, his voice firm. "Someone here knows more than they've told. We've found a cloth, stained with blood, discarded in the garden near the greenhouse's back entrance. And this—" He held up a small brass key, its surface scratched. "It doesn't fit the cabinet in the potting shed, but it belongs somewhere in this manor. Who dropped it?" His gaze was stern, but Miss Marple's was softer, probing, as if inviting the guilty to betray themselves. Sir Reginald snorted, his watch chain glinting as he crossed his arms. "I've no need for keys or sneaking about. I was in my study, as the butler will confirm." Arthur's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I left at midnight. I swear, I'd never harm him." Molly's eyes glistened, her voice barely audible. "I only brought the tools, nothing more." Dr. Carver's chin lifted, her tone icy. "You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple. I had no reason to kill Cedric. My fight was for credit, not blood." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile serene but unyielding. "Credit, Doctor. Carver can be as precious as gold. And the orchid was your claim to it, wasn't it? You believed, Doctor. Hawthorne stole your work, your legacy. That wound runs deep." She paused, her eyes lingering on the green smudge, the torn page in her mind's eye. "But the truth," she said, "is like a seed. It needs only the right moment to break through." The tension in the greenhouse was palpable. The suspects' faces, a gallery of fear, anger, and denial. Miss Marple's trap was set, the clues laid bare, like tools on a workbench. She knew the killer stood among them, their hearts racing beneath a carefully tended facade. The final piece, she felt, was close, a word, a glance, a slip that would reveal the hand that had struck in the night. Chapter 12. The Truth Unearthed. The greenhouse at Thornfield Manor stood bathed in the soft glow of lanterns, their light flickering across the glass panes like fireflies caught in a jar. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and orchids, and the Orchidaceae ignota gleamed on the workbench. Its violet petals a silent accusation in the tense silence. Miss Jane Marple stood at the centre of the gathered suspects. Arthur Finch, Sir Reginald Voss, Dr. Evelyn Carver, and Molly Green, her slight figure commanding the space with a quiet authority that belied her gentle demeanour. Her knitting needles rested in her bag, untouched for now, as her sharp blue eyes moved from face to face, reading the flickers of fear, defiance, and guilt that played across them like shadows on the greenhouse walls. Inspector Crane stood beside her, his broad frame a solid presence, his gaze stern as he watched the group, ready to act on Miss Marple's signal. Lady Beatrice Langley sat near the garden entrance, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, soft but clear, like a bell ringing in a quiet village. "We stand here," she said, "in the place where Dr. Cedric Hawthorne's life was taken, to unearth the truth. This orchid, this Orchidaceae ignota, was no mere plant. It was a prize worth millions, a promise of fame and fortune. But it was also a spark that ignited envy, greed, and betrayal." Her eyes rested briefly on each suspect, noting Arthur's trembling hands, Sir Reginald's flushed face, Dr. Carver's rigid posture, and Molly's downcast eyes. "Someone among you," she continued, "coveted this orchid so fiercely that they struck Dr. Hawthorne down, leaving behind a footprint, a torn page, a vial of deadly extract, and a key that unlocks more than a lock." Sir Reginald Voss blustered, his voice a low rumble. "This is nonsense. I've told you. I was in my study, counting my losses, not adding to them." His watch chain glinted as he crossed his arms, his eyes darting to Dr. Carver. Arthur Finch pushed his spectacles up his nose, his voice barely audible. "I love Dr. Hawthorne. He was my mentor. I'd never harm him." Molly Green twisted her apron, her voice a whisper. "I only did my job, ma'am. I swear it." Dr. Carver's grey eyes flashed, her lips a thin line. "You're chasing ghosts, Miss Marple." "I fought Cedric with words, not weapons." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her gaze was unyielding, like sunlight piercing a fog. "Words can cut as deeply as shears, Dr. Carver," she said, stepping closer to the workbench. "Let us consider the night of the murder. At 9, Sir Reginald, you argued with Dr. Hawthorne about selling the orchid, a prize you saw as your financial salvation. At 10, Molly, you fetched tools for him, leaving them here. At 11, a maid saw you, Doctor. Carver, near the greenhouse, though you claim you were in your room. And Arthur, you stayed until midnight, sorting notes close to this very spot. Yet at 1, someone entered, struck Dr. Hawthorne with pruning shears, and vanished, leaving a footprint and a wiped-clean handle." She paused, her eyes settling on Doctor Carver, whose face had paled, though her chin remained high. "Dr. Carver," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but relentless, "you believed Dr. Hawthorne stole your life's work, this orchid which you discovered together years ago. Its medicinal promise was to be your triumph, but he claimed it, leaving you with nothing but bitterness. You confronted him that night, didn't you? Not at 8, as you said, but later, near 11, when the maid saw you." Dr. Carver's lips parted, a protest forming, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture as commanding as it was gentle. "You came to the greenhouse," she continued, "to demand your share of the glory. But Dr. Hawthorne refused, perhaps laughed, as you said he did before. In a moment of rage, you seized the pruning shears, there, on the workbench and struck him. She pointed to the blood-stained soil, her voice steady. You wiped the handle, but you left a footprint small and sharp, like the heels you wear. And this? She produced the torn notebook page, its green ink smudged, retrieved from evidence. This page, with your formula, was torn in haste, its ink matching the pen found in your room. A cloth, stained with blood, was found near the garden entrance, where you fled. Dr. Carver's face drained of colour, her handkerchief falling to the floor as her hands shook. You have no proof, she cried, her voice cracking like brittle glass. This is conjecture, nothing more. But Miss Marple's eyes held hers, calm and unyielding. The proof, Dr. Carver, is in the details. The green ink on your cuff, the footprint that matches your shoe, the maid's testimony, and this. Inspector Crane stepped forward, holding a small leather case, opened to reveal a pen with green ink, found in Dr. Carver's guest room. Your pen, Miss Marple said, used to write the formula you claimed as yours. The formula Dr. Hawthorne kept in his notebook. The greenhouse seemed to hold its breath, the suspects frozen, their eyes on Dr. Carver. She staggered back, her defiance crumbling, and sank onto a stool, her face in her hands. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered, her voice raw. I only wanted what was mine. He laughed, said I'd never prove it was my discovery. I grabbed the shears. It was a moment, a terrible moment. Her sobs echoed in the humid air, and Inspector Crane signalled the butler, who fetched 2 constables waiting outside. As Dr. Carver was led away, her head bowed. Miss Marple turned to Lady Beatrice, who had risen, her face pale but relieved. "Oh, Jane," she said, "how did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost sad. People, Beatrice, are like plants. They reveal themselves in their habits. Dr. Carver's envy was a weed that choked her reason. The clues, the footprint, the ink, the cloth, were merely the soil in which it grew. She glanced at the orchid, its petals glowing faintly. This plant inspired great folly, but also great truth. Arthur Finch wiped his eyes. Molly clutched her apron, and Sir Reginald muttered under his breath, his bluster subdued. Inspector Crane closed his notebook, his scepticism replaced by grudging respect. "You've done it, Miss Marple," he said, "but that key, it still doesn't fit the cabinet." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps, Inspector, it unlocks something else, a desk, a diary, a heart. But for now, our work here is done." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag, her needles resuming their soft rhythm. She stepped into the cool night, the greenhouse behind her, a silent testament to the secrets it had held. "Envy," she murmured to Lady Beatrice, who walked beside her, "is a dangerous bloom, but truth, like a garden, always finds a way to grow." The manor's lights glowed, warmly ahead, and Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a mystery resolved, its roots unearthed at last.